Okay. I should be live, hopefully, allegedly. Let me see here. Play on this Mac. Okay. So, here's the scenario. I am currently in my living room, connected to my router to my modem directly. No, with my router, with a long ass wire, the old-fashioned way. And so I wait for people to roll in. Um, what I would, so we left off last time talking about things that we could do to make the class more interesting, especially perhaps for extra credit. And I floated the idea of a movie club, sort of like a book club, but for films. And what we would do is we would have, in addition to the 2 movies that we'd have to watch for the class, I'm thinking maybe either 3 or 4 extra movies. I see a big spinning ball of death. I want to make sure that I am streaming properly here. Can you all see me? Can you all hear me? It looks like the buffering is just as bad. Let me see. Yeah, 0 kilobytes. Okay, well this is getting annoying. Okay. Alright, well, looks like it's working. Let's go back to Keynote. Let me know if this is better or worse than last time. If this is not better, then I'm not quite sure what to do here, because then it's my internet and not my Wi-Fi. My Wi-Fi I can fix. My internet, not so much. So we'll make it work. I'll try to figure out something. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I'll figure out something. So I guess let's start from where I was talking before about movie club, which is, I think for an extra credit for this class, and again, if there's buy-in from you guys, if there's a green light from you guys, then that's great. It would be to do, in addition to the 2 movies that we're going to be watching, again, Max and Jojo Rabbit, adding 3 extras to that list. And 3, if not 4, depending on how many people are interested, how many people are looking to get extra 10 points. As of right now, I get the feeling that those movies are going to be 1917, which came out recently on video on demand. The Death of Stalin, which is a very funny but black comedy. So if that's your genre, you'll like it. And The Eichmann Show on Netflix. Those are 3 sort of solid movies talking on some big story beats that we're talking about in class. There might be a 4th in there. I'll take your Rex. I need something probably for later on, historically after Eichmann. Something more Cold War related. If you have any suggestions, if there's something that you guys want to see, let me know, and I'm happy to incorporate that. And I think the way we would do that would be with since I have the Zoom live streaming, would probably be to do some sort of Zoom live stream there after the movies. So like give a deadline to watch the movies, and then we sort of get together after all having seen it, and we discuss the movie on Zoom, and I'll take attendance for those. And maybe also a reaction paper. I'm not sure. So that's sort of where my head's at with this. Dave Rosano here says that it is buffering rather heavily. Let me see. Oh yeah, spinning ball of death. All right, hold up. Let me pause this for a second. Let me go to... Can I pause the stream if I go to live streaming? Yes, there's only one way to find out. There is not. Okay. I'm sorry. The only thing I can hope for is that the quality, when this is all said and done, is better when it goes online. I'm there's not much else I can do here with this. Anyway, the other thing I'm gonna have to do with discussion sections. A couple of you asked if you could do it earlier because you work on weekends. I mean, you could do it earlier. I don't see an issue as to why not. I think the only issue is that you missed the lecture when doing that, and I mean, let me rephrase that. If you have to, you have to. It's not going to count against you. I got a couple emails asking if they could do discussions early. Again, rule of thumb is if you're doing the work, you'll get credit for it. And if it's before the lecture, if it's after the lecture, it's better for you if you do it after, but it's not going to impact your grades significantly if you do it before. So I really would not stress about that. I guess the last thing would be office hours, which is we need to have some kind of availability for office hours. Problem is, of course, we can't meet face-to-face, so they got two options here. Either I do a long sort of live stream where I'm just available and doing other things and you guys can shoot me questions in chat, or some sort of Zoom conference where you hit me up and say, hey, I have questions for you, and we'll figure out a way to make that work. Those are your options. Again, I appreciate your feedback here. I feel like I'm talking to the wind and not getting a lot back, but if there's anything you would like to see, let me know. And I think on that note, that's really it. I guess I'll move on. So, I mentioned last class that we would talk about the end of World War I here. And that is partially correct, because our end of World War I class is going to span over 2 lectures. We're going to look at the effects of World War I in Russia and in Germany. Generally speaking, though, if we have to recap, I said World War I is the first real major dividing line in European history. There's a well, not the first major, second major. But there is a Europe before and there's a Europe after World War I. I also said that it's extremely damaging to the people that fight in it, psychologically, socially. The whole discussion for last time, it was about the psychology of people going home, though. This diagnoses of PTSD done for the real first time. I also mentioned that it's the first war after the Industrial Revolution. It's the first sort of modern industrial war, but without the rules of engagement that we have created in the aftermath of that sort of war. And so because there are no rules of engagement, there's no lines that can't be crossed. So things like chemical weapons and landmines and all of these things are used all the time during World War I. It is predominantly fought due to trench warfare. And so what ends up happening is after it becomes apparent that just charging into battle is not going to work, you have generals and such electing to create giant trenches and working through stalemates and waiting out the opposition, taking pot shots at each other. And the land between those trenches we call no man's land. You see this both in Junger and in Remarque about how horrific this is, although both of them kind of commenting differently about the war itself. As I mentioned, it caused the collapse of 3 major empires, the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, which we haven't really talked about because I don't really see it as a major part of the class, but know that it happened, and the Russian Empire, which we're going to see today. And as we're going to see today, Russia leaves the war early because it faces revolution at home. And that's going to be a common trend throughout the 3 empires. World War I doesn't end because there was this big military victory, or because Germany gets their ass handed to them, or France gets their asses handed to them. No, not like that. World War I ends because essentially 3 of the 5 countries that are fighting it decide to stop playing. They experience a revolution at home caused by the extreme sort of pressure and fatigue that the war causes on their home economies, and the civilian populations of these countries essentially say, no, we don't want to fight in this war anymore, and that's kind of what happened. We do, however, need to talk a little bit about Russia in general, because Russia is historically rather unique in its history. It is, I call it here a feudal relic. This is because, as we sort of hinted at in our class on Napoleon, this was the only European country that had not experienced some kind of revolution in the aftermath of Napoleon, or had not experienced revolution independently the way England or the United States or France had. What that ends up meaning in practice is that going into World War I, Russia is still a feudal society. Think back to that sort of understanding of feudalism that we talked about all the way back in lecture 2, way back when. And we talked about the system of nobles and peasants. That still exists in Russia well into the 20th century, and that should scare you. It's a predominantly rural society with a predominantly agricultural background. It is run by the Tsar. And the Tsar, spell that out, Czar, is actually a Russification of the word Caesar. This sort of imperial family of totalitarian rulers that are ruling Russia with an iron fist. And we are talking about what is essentially an absolutely powerful feudal monarchy, which would, not fine, but which would have been expected if the year had been 1600, not in the year 1917, which is when the revolution in Russia starts to happen. Like all good things in life, the Russian Revolution comes in 3 parts. You have the February Revolution of 1917, which is the first revolution against the Tsar. The October Revolution of 1917, still, which is the revolution that the communists and that Lenin does. And lastly, the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922. What are we talking about when we talk about when we talk about these 3 parts of the revolution? Well, let's start with February. So February of 1917, the war is at its highest peak. Russia has been in the war since the beginning. For the past 3 years, Russia has been in the war. But unlike other industrialized countries, Russia wins wars differently. So think about it this way. Think about, let's say you are a country like Germany, and you want to win a war. And you win a war by making sure that your soldiers have the best equipment, that they're well equipped and they're good supply lines, and that you win by out-supplying and out-maneuvering the opposition. This is how the Union won the Civil War, if you guys remember back to that class. This is not how Russia wins wars. Russia does not win wars through the quality of its armies. Russia wins wars through the quantity of its armies. Russia can throw men at a problem until the problem goes away, which historically, until this point, not a problem. I mean, this is how Russia wins wars. But when you apply that logic to World War I, when you're sending in soldiers without guns, literally sometimes without guns, they were expected to pick up the guns from their fallen comrades or from the enemies that they killed. This is the level, right? You are literally throwing men at the problem until the problem goes away. This means that going into February of 1917, Russia has exponentially more dead than any other European country. and it's not close. We're talking, other countries have tens of thousands. Russia has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dead. And there is a lot of anger and dissatisfaction. And the revolution in February is, for the most part, led by women, mothers and wives and sisters whose husbands or children have not gone fighting yet or have been recently set to the front line, and they're worried for their safety. And so this is one of the first truly female-led movements in terms of revolutionary politics, on par with that of the suffragist movement in the UK and in the United States. And as I said, it occurs out of dissatisfaction with the war, but it also occurs out of dissatisfaction with the Tsar himself. His family, the Tsar and his family, they're these feudal autocrats. They're these feudal, absolute power monarchies. Like France before its revolution, it also has a series of scandals and poor decisions. And remember what I said, monarchies run on prestige. If the monarchy will only survive if you believe firmly that the person in charge, the king, would do a better job than your average Joe at running the country. There is a prestige to the monarchy. But the minute that stops being true, the minute you think of the king not as a, enlightened ruler, but just some schmuck, well, monarchy starts to tremble and crackle and rattle. We're going to look at Rasputin in a second because this is a truly fascinating story. And I have to say, as we mentioned before, Russia the war is going extremely poorly for Russia. It's because Russia has traditionally won its wars by outnumbering and overwhelming the enemy with its poorly equipped soldiers. So they're not giving the soldiers guns and stuff. They're literally just throwing them into trenches, hoping that they'll find some way to win. The logic here is, think about SEAL Team 6, highly advanced, well-equipped, well-trained soldiers facing off against 1,000 peasants with pitchforks. And Russia doesn't care that they lose 800 of those 1,000 peasants because they have more. And so this is how Russia wins. But when you apply that to the meat grinder that is World War I, lots and lots and lots of people die in Russia. And it's hard to state the level of human tragedy that World War I is to the Russian people. And so the February Revolution is a revolution that unites a bunch of disparate factions in Russia, where you have a lot of competing interests, all agreeing that the Tsar has to go. All well and good. Let's talk about Rasputin for a second, because Rasputin is an interesting guy. Rasputin is a faith healer. He is for all intents and purposes, a homeless person who is able to convince the Tsar's wife in the middle of the war that he is going to cure their son. Now, their son has, I believe it's hemophilic porphyria or something like that. It's one of those diseases that causes extreme weakness, but usually goes away with puberty. But Rasputin comes in and he essentially tricks the Tsarina, the Tsar's wife, into giving him access to the son and saying, I'm going to cure your kid. I'm going to cure your kid. And when the kid hits puberty and grows up and sort of moves past this disease that he had, Rasputin is treated like this savior of the monarchy. Now, everyone with eyes could see what had happened here, but the Tsar and his family are convinced that this is the savior of Russia. And so he's basically living in the lap of luxury for decades and decades and decades. And this really undermines the legitimacy of the monarchy, just letting this random guy in to live in the royal palace, essentially. However, the February Revolution occurs, and the monarchy, the Tsar, is removed from power. Now, importantly, the Tsar is not killed. He is simply removed from power and is replaced by Alexander Kerensky. And much like Robespierre in the French Revolution, Kerensky is picked because he's the person that's sort of in the middle and that everyone could agree on, and everyone, if they could not at least like him, they could not actively not like him, if that makes sense. And Kerensky does a lot of things. Kerensky runs on a platform of sort of those liberalizing reforms that we talked about with Napoleon. Those rational reforms, bringing sort of an end to feudalism, the land reform, the economic reforms, all the things that we said were great things. But Kerensky makes one mistake. And Kerensky severely misunderstands the movement that brings him to power. Namely, Kerensky decides that he's going to stay in the war. And the reason Kerensky stays in the war is, in his mind at least, that eventually the war will end. Eventually, this giant conflagration that had never been seen before will come to an end. It will come to pass. And when it does, Russia will need friends. But it will not find friends if it leaves the war early, because it will have actively fought against one side of the war and actively betrayed the other side of the war. It's a lose-lose scenario if you leave the war early. And his logic is fine, but again, he fundamentally misunderstands why he was brought to power. He was brought to power to exit the war, to stop the killing. And this is why the October Revolution happens. He is a unity candidate, as I said, just to recap what I just said. Kerensky is a unity candidate. All the factions can not agree on, but don't actively hate him. He does all of the reforms that we talked about, the removal of feudal privileges, implementing the Constitution, liberalizing the economy, all things that are great. All those rational reforms, as Cohn called them, that Napoleon brings to the world, that brings to Europe, Kerensky brings to Russia. However, Kerensky does not leave the war, and that's the big thing. If Kerensky doesn't leave the war, that means that he's not embracing the revolutionary politics that brought him to power. And this leads to anger and resentment, and based on our timeline from before, you sort of may guess where this is going. He fundamentally misunderstands why he was put into power. Enter one Vladimir Lenin. So the story is that Lenin had been exiled. There had been a previous attempt of takeover in 1905 by the communists in Russia, during which the Tsar executes Lenin's older brother, and Lenin himself is exiled to Vienna. And I think I mentioned this briefly in another class, but there is a period of Viennese history that I would just love to see put to film or television, where Lenin, Hitler, Freud, and I think Stalin too, are living in like a 4-block radius in the center of Vienna. It's crazy. But Lenin has been living in Vienna through the whole war. And then when news of the Kerensky movement, the revolution in February, reaches the Austrians see an opportunity here. Because until this point, Germany and Austria have been fighting a war on two fronts. The Western Front with France and the Eastern Front with Russia. And that they could very much solve the problem if they could get Russia out of the war. And because they see the Kerensky government as fundamentally weak, they sense an opportunity. And so what they do is they take Lenin and they smuggle him in a train. Smuggle used lightly. As you see here, here's a picture of him leaving Vienna the day he leaves. It's not exactly quiet about it. But he is essentially put on the night train and sent into Moscow with one directive and one directive alone: cause trouble. Now, to be clear, the Austrians and the Germans do not believe that Lenin will be successful. They do not believe that there is enough anger in Russia for Lenin's sort of revolutionary brand of politics to be widely successful in Russia. What they believe will happen, however, is that Lenin will get enough of a following, and that enough of a following will cause enough trouble that eventually Kerensky will be forced to leave the war to address the problems at home. That's what they're counting on. And so Lenin arrives in Moscow, immediately facing a problem. Here's his platform. This is the platform that Lenin is running on. An immediate exit from the war, end to World War I, and an end to the draft. That's a big one. So it's not just that we're going to end the war, we're also going to stop calling up your kids when they turn 18 to go fight in a war that, maybe some of them were too young to remember when it started. He also promises a home or a plot of land for every Russian citizen. So this goes even beyond the feudal reforms that we talked about with Napoleon. Because if you remember, the Napoleon-style land reform was if you work a piece of land, that piece of land should belong to you. And that's all well and good, but that does not help people living in the city. That doesn't really help the working class. Because the working class are, they don't own land. They don't work land. The working class rents, right? And so he wants to guarantee a home or a plot of farmland for every citizen. He also calls for something that, this is something that Russians really care about, an end to starvation. He believes that Russia should be providing food for each of its citizens. No child should go hungry in Russia. He summarizes this with a slogan, and that slogan is peace, land, and bread. These are the three core promises of Russia's revolution. Now, compare that to the three core promises of America's revolution, those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when faced with that, Leninists would say, right, but your right to your liberty doesn't keep the rain off of your head or the snow off of your head. It doesn't keep you warm at night. Your right to life or to the pursuit of happiness doesn't fill your stomach. The core promises of America's revolution are abstracts. They're intangibles. Lenin is promising tangible, sort of concrete things. He is promising an end to war, land for everyone, and food for everyone. And so this makes Lenin out the gate extremely popular. It makes Lenin a superstar. The problem is that Lenin can't go out and campaign like a normal person because Lenin is in Russia illegally. Lenin is in Russia illegally. He is still banned. And if the police catch Lenin, he will be shot because he has returned to Russia, breaking his exile. And so what do we do? Well, Lenin invents the Vanguard Party. The Vanguard Party is described in What Is to Be Done, which is something you had to read for today. And in What Is to Be Done, Lenin describes a system that functions very similarly to, I guess, what we call a modern terrorist group. Lenin invents modern political terrorism. What does that mean? He essentially limits the flow of information through the organization and limits membership to the organization. So, let's say the police would like to catch up with Lenin, right? In order to catch up with Lenin, each of these circles is a figure in the movement here, right? Information gets passed down the circle, down the hierarchy here, from higher-ranking members to low-ranking members. So let's say the political police would like to catch Lenin. They have to essentially work their way up the pyramid, by which point Lenin will be gone. They have to work up the pyramid, at which point Lenin can run away. This has been applied in many different contexts all over the world, in all sorts of organizations. This model that Lenin creates, and it is created in such a way that is applicable. Simply put, organizations use the Leninist model Because the Leninist model works. One of the craziest stories I've heard, I think a couple years ago now, was of a cell of ISIS members operating through Europe. And they were using a similar technique. Each cell is a group of 3 in this platform, in this organization, right? The thing that these members were using to communicate with each other was something so genius that it had never occurred to me. And that they were using I think Xbox 360 Live chat in Call of Duty. Now you might think, well, that's crazy. Why would they do that? The reason being is, where else could you feasibly talk about guns, bombs, and grenades without, setting off any flags? It's kind of smart if you think about it. In the age of the internet, you don't only know 2-3 other people in your organization. You know a username. You understand what I'm saying with this? This model is broadly applicable because it works. He says in What is to be Done that I assert no movement can endure without a stable organization of leaders maintaining continuity. Now I ask that you read between the lines here. Namely, if I die, if the stable organization of leaders is removed, the organization cannot endure. Let's read between the lines of what he's saying here, right? If I die, this ends, number 1. Number 2, that the broader the popular mass drawn spontaneously into the struggle, which forms the basis of the movement and participates in it, the more urgent the need for such an organization and the more solid this organization should be. Namely, the more support this movement has, the more support my organization has, the more urgent there will be needed for a sort of vanguard underground movement that can engage in this sort of Leninist brand of political terrorism and revolutionary activity. Thirdly, that such an organization must consist chiefly of persons engaged in revolutionary activity. And again, I ask you to read between the lines. Revolutionary activity, what do you think that is? It's people who can make bombs, or can do poisonings, or can cause strikes, or can sabotage industry or sabotage the war effort. Revolutionary activity in this case specifically means actions that can be taken in the furtherance of the goal no matter the cost. But this also means that anyone who is not doing these things, all of the policy experts and the legal experts and all of the things that make up a modern political party, cannot exist in Lenin's movement because Lenin's movement is underground. All right, you're limiting membership of this vanguard party to people that are specifically engaging in revolutionary activity. And 4, in an autocratic state, the more we confine membership of such an organization to people that are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity and who have been professionally trained in the art of combating the political police, the more difficult it will be to catch the organization. Simply put, if we confine our membership to these people, the harder it will be to catch us. And lastly, the greater there will be the number of people from the working classes, there's a bit of a typo here, and other classes that will be able to join the movement and perform active work in it. Essentially what he's saying here is that you don't need a particular education to be a member of Lenin's party. You don't need advanced degrees and all of these things. So anyone from any walk of life can join Lenin's movement so long as they acquire, to quote Mr. Neeson, a particular set of skills that can be used to further the movement. And eventually, in October, the Leninists strike. Armed insurrection in the street. The October Revolution occurs. You have armed communists seizing the capital and specifically taking over the government. We've won. The communists have won. Now what? Right? The big question in the immediate aftermath of October, where you have this coup essentially against Kerensky, is now what do the communists do? And there's a couple of things. Lenin begins to implement the platform. Lenin begins to set forth all of the promises that he set out to do. He begins to immediately pull Russia out of the war. That's step one. Russia is out of the war. Step two, he needs to figure out a way to feed and house every Russian. Because the war part is easy. The other two are a little harder. Soon we realize, however, that there is a bit of a problem with Lenin's party being in charge. You see, ironically, the thing that made Lenin's party very difficult to catch and prevent from engaging in revolutionary activity, the limiting of people that are engaged, limiting membership in the party exclusively to people that were engaged in this political terrorism, also meant that we kicked out all of the people that were good at running government, right? And so we have only a couple options here when we want to do thing of do all the functions of running a government. We got rid of all the policymakers. Oops. So we need to figure out how to run the government here. And we have a couple options. Who's going to run the trains in Russia? Who's going to run the essential services? And what Lenin decides to do here, the party collectively, but Lenin, with the other members of the party, they decide to invite back the old policy people that had worked for the Tsar. Not for Kerensky, not Kerensky's people, the old imperial government. Right? Because think about it. The Tsar was not exactly a qualified person to do all these things either, but he had a whole government asset around him as well that was doing all of these things like running the trains and running the sewers and making sure the roads were paved and making sure garbage was collected. All of the basic things the government does. Because Lenin is forced with the options of doing nothing, or letting Phil the bomb maker run the trains, not a brilliant idea, or inviting back these old guys. Now bear in mind, these guys don't love Lenin either. They're doing it because it's a job, but these guys are fascists for all intents and purposes. These guys are worse than Kerensky's people. And so Lenin has to compromise here, and he starts to show the cracks in this movement. The second issue arises with the dock workers in Petrograd. Now, Petrograd is St. Petersburg. During the war, this is a crazy story. The Tsar essentially says, St. Petersburg sounds too Germany, so we're going to change it. We're going to call it Petrograd. It's a proper Russian name, and the name sort of stuck. So when I say Petrograd, I mean St. Petersburg. Because you need to feed a bunch of people really, really fast, what ends up happening is the dock workers are forced to work double, triple time because Russia, is trying to buy food to feed everyone, to feed all of these workers that they're now doing to industrialize their economy really rapidly. These people need to eat. And while we can wait for the food to get grown to come in, people need to eat tomorrow. And so he begins importing a lot of food, which is all well and good, but that means that the dock workers, the people that are physically getting the goods off the ships and onto the docks, are working 3, 4, 5 times as much. And it ends up not working well for them. And so they go on strike. Hence the option. Let's say this is our hypothetical face-off between the dock workers and their union rep. Funnily enough, the Russian word for union is Soviet. And so the Soviet Union is quite simply the union of unions. You might find that funny. I always found that rather hilarious. And so here's the leader of the Petrograd Soviet essentially saying, we're working longer hours and working conditions are awful. Please fix this condition or we will be forced to strike. Problem is, of course, that the communist government doesn't have the extra money and cannot afford to have these people work less. And so, here's what happens. The union leader is killed. Anyone else have a problem with our working conditions? And it turns out people get back to work rather quickly. And which leads the Soviets in the scenario of killing workers in order to help workers. The second question, however, is the question of what to do with the Tsar. Because if you remember, Kerensky did not kill the Tsar is still alive. Because the Tsar is alive, this means he is still a problem. And there's a third part of the revolution that we did not talk about. The Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War begins almost immediately in October because it turns out when you take power by force, all of the other groups in charge might not like you very much. And in the east, in Siberia, an army has formed. These people call themselves the White Russians. What the White Russians want is a return, not to Kerensky's government, a return to the Tsar. They want the Tsar and his family restored to power. Kerensky was an interesting blip, but if the Tsar agrees to some constitutional reforms, we'll take the Tsar back. Thank you very much. This leads to a problem for Lenin. Because if you remember, the last time a member of Lenin's family capitulated to the Tsar, Lenin's brother, that person ended up dead. And Lenin knows, doesn't know, but has a strong feeling that if Lenin gives up, outnumbered and outgunned by this army in the East, that he will die. That his movement will die then and there will not be another chance. Especially because now that the war is over, you have all of these European powers giving all of their extra weaponry to these White Russians. Remember, imagine you're Austria for a second. You sent Lenin to Russia thinking he was going to cause trouble, and he caused so much trouble. The communists storm the Heritage, which is the Russian Tsar's winter palace. And everyone inside of there is killed. Man, woman, and child, and baby. The reasoning is rather simple. Because anyone with his name, anyone with the Romanov name, could be used as a puppet by these monarchists to get what they wanted. And so they all had to die. Now, years later, there was a girl in Vienna called Anastasia who would claim to be the daughter. Her accounts were never verified or corroborated, but historical record says that they all died that day. And Lenin thought that this would bring an end to it, that with no Tsar, the Tsarists would go home, that the monarchists would go home if there was no monarchy to restore. It turns out that that was not the case. It turns out that being a baby killer doesn't exactly make you popular. And this only makes the monarchists angrier. The monarchists have now gathered an army much, much larger than than whatever non-army the Russians had. Because remember, one of the first things that Lenin does is he gets rid of the army, ends the draft, and pulls out of the war. Lenin doesn't have an army. Lenin is working on working with nothing, and meanwhile he has this professional army facing him down. And when pushed between a rock and a hard place, Lenin ends up breaking the core promise he made. The one core promise he made. Lenin forms the Red Army. He reinstates the draft, hoping to... sorry. I don't have it. Don't freak out. I don't have it. Hoping to win the war. And let's be clear. Lenin is outgunned, he's outnumbered, he's out-equipped, he's outmaneuvered. All of the special, the advanced generals are with the White Russians. Every rule of logic and of warfare would say Lenin is toast. But by some miracle, perhaps in the embers of his own hypocrisy, Lenin wins. There is no reason for this to have happened, right? There is no logic of warfare that says Lenin should have won this battle. But Lenin does. Lenin wins. And in so doing, Lenin has cemented his place as the singular ruler of Russia. And now can finally get back to, having made these hard, difficult decisions, can get back to ruling Russia, you might think. And of course, on the eve of his victory, on the night of his victory, the 22nd, in 1922, Lenin suffers a stroke and dies. It's one of history's great ironies, because, we can never really know what kind of Russia Lenin would have crafted after the, initial difficulties that we've talked about. What we do know is that when Lenin dies, he is replaced by Stalin, a man with all of Lenin's moral flexibility, but none of his ideological purpose. We will talk about Stalin more in detail next week. However, it bears thinking about. There is a Russia that could have been. There's two Russias that could have been. There's a Russia that could have been had the October Revolution failed and had Kerensky been able to slowly reform, Russia's society into something that more resembles a Western country. And there's another Russia that could have been, which is one in which Stalin never came to power, and sort of Lenin's brand of communism takes hold. I guess we will never know. I guess what I will say, though, here is that I think I'm going to end it here. Not a ton of you watching live, not a ton of questions coming in. This is pretty straightforward. Bit of a bummer of a class, I'm not going to lie to you. But here's what I'll say. I am working on getting that extra credit movie stuff set up. I'm hoping that by Sunday that should be done, as will grading, hopefully, allegedly, that should be done by Sunday. And other than that, I think we can call it a day, guys. Talk to you guys soon, and enjoy your weekend. Stay safe out there. Stay home, please. Bye. And end stream.